From the early sunny days of spring in the muddy back bays to the frigid surf fishing in December, you have a wide variety of fly choice when it comes to fishing for stripers throughout the 8 to 10 months of fishing we have here on the East Coast. In this video, we'll be discussing how your choice of presentation, time of year, and water temps can affect your choice of fly when fly fishing for the Maroon saxatilis, or better known as the striped bass or rockfish. Hey folks, Mike from LI Flies Mike here. This is our second episode in our new series called Fly Fishing for Striped Bass. If you enjoy this type of fly fishing video or fly tying, then be sure to like the video and subscribe as we post 3 to 4 videos a week on these topics. Now let's get into the video. Match the hatch versus searching or attractor flies. So quickly, I'd like to point out two types of fly choices, if you will. I'll be using these terms throughout the video and future videos, so it's pretty important to understand these terms. Searching flies. So all around generic patterns, good for fan casting or blind casting. If you're unfamiliar with the area or you're not certain if the fish are even around, these searching flies can work really well. They either push water or get the fish's attention in other ways via action. Fish will patrol areas and work edges and rips primarily, so focus on these ambush points and feeding lanes. Use flies that will push water and get the fish's attention via their lateral lines. So match the hatch. Times when stripers will key in on particular baits and how the correct fly, including the shape and profile, and more importantly, the presentation, are key at times to getting bites. So those are the two terms. With that out of the way, we can talk about the main subject of this video, and that's how the water temps and times of year can affect your choice of fly when fly fishing for stripers. For now, we'll be talking about springtime, but closer to around June, I'll be making a video about summer fishing. So, water temps and times of year. Springtime, beginning of the migration. Every marine and terrestrial organism is pushing for the start of springtime. The changing of the season brings warmer weather and increased sunlight, which in turn warms our waters quickly, attracting fish as well as bait fish. So fishing early in the season, we generally tend to focus on areas where the water warms the quickest. So any muddy bottom, salt pond, back bay, creeks like this, that will get a lot of sunlight and that have a dark bottom to absorb that heat. Usually these are the areas that we start come late March, early April across the East Coast. I usually catch my first stripers locally around the 1st to 2nd week of April, and these fish have sea lice, so they're fresh fish from the ocean migrating north. The estuaries that border or make up the muddy bottom, back bays, and creeks attract these early migrating fish, and they need as much energy as possible because they're constantly pushing north. So they're pretty much trying to feed as much as they can, and they're going into these warmer areas because this is where the highest influx of bait is. So these areas act as spawning grounds or sanctuary for the juvenile bait fish, the crabs, the shrimps, even clams that striped bass will forage on before the migratory bait fish like the adult bunker arrive later in the season. Easy prey for the new arrivals. They fuel up on their journey up north, so the fish will enter via the inlets in the ocean and will work particularly outgoing tides when the warmer water will flush this bait out of these creeks and back bays. So the warmer water from these creeks will flush out with the outgoing tide, sweeping the juvenile bait and the crustaceans, the shrimp, all along with it. Striped bass will work these rips and outflows like culverts, creeks, places like these, and taking advantage of these easy meals. Picking a simple fly like a clouser or small bucktail deceiver, or even a shrimp fly like the ultra shrimp, can allow you to match the smaller forage that these fish are feeding on at this time of the year. A lot of times fish will focus on edges and drop-offs as their prime ambush spots for these bass to take advantage of this outgoing tide. At times, stripers can even stack up in rips and act like trout, feeding on shrimp and small bait fish that are flushing out with the tide. It definitely pays to have a variety of flies, so again, something like a clouser minnow or a jiggy can get down deeper in the water column at times, which is important. And particularly when it's cold out, having a fly with an exaggerated jigging motion, like these weighted flies, can be the ticket to enticing a fish to eat. Getting deeper in the water column at times with a sinking line can be important because sometimes the water temps can change from the surface down lower. There's all sorts of currents and rips. So it pays to have flies to be able to fish in various depths throughout the water column so you can try and find where the fish are. One of my favorite spring flies focuses on imitating the herring and bunker that move in early in the season, the bucktail deceiver by Bob Popovics. So even though a lot of the bait is smaller In my area, we get a large influx of small to large bunker and herring, and the herring will run into lakes and ponds to spawn, so we get a lot of herring that move in, and these fish are generally anywhere from 8 to 10 inches. Slot-sized fish will take advantage of this larger, higher caloric food source, so throwing medium to large flies can work really well, even though there's generally a lot of spearing and crab and shrimp that are in the area. This is my go-to searching fly for blind casting. They push a lot of water and have great movement, helping to entice eats. Flatwings are fantastic for that reason alone as well, for the movement in the tail. So flies that have a ton of movement without stripping them are key at a lot of times for presentation, because you will not just be stripping flies throughout the year. If you're only stripping flies, then you're missing out on a lot of prime opportunities to catch fish. Being able to wet fly swing, dead drift, grease line fish, being able to fish all throughout the water column in various ways and present the fly in various manners is really important throughout the year, particularly in the springtime. So getting into late spring, or talking about late spring fishing. The fast increase or decrease in temperature can both be the reason why fishing intermittently just turns off. All fish require stability when it comes to temperature and oxygen levels, but striped bass seem to be very sensitive when it comes to temperature changes. A cold front in the spring with a frigid rainy day can push the fish out and shut down a good bite. There's always variables, but pay attention to when your best days are in the spring and keep track of these things. You'll find that stable sunny weather the following week could have an impact on your fishing that day. Talking to the master of casting big flies, Mark Sadati, he really ran home the importance of temperature and the comfortability of fish. He notes at certain temperatures striped bass would be more active, or generally the fishing would be better. And this was anywhere from 62 to 72 degrees. And after the water temps went above 72 or 70 degrees, certain bites would just shut off, or the fish would seemingly move out of areas completely. Striped bass are truly creatures of habit when it comes to how they feed and act at certain times of the year, and paying attention to wind direction, sun, temperature, tide, etc., and using a fishing journal can help you find bites consistently year after year. And it helps to start in the springtime when starting to pay attention to these certain feeding activities and migration patterns. That being said, unfortunately, due to the rising global sea temperatures and the fact that striped bass have had abysmal spawning results over the past 5 to 10 years, my inshore fishing has suffered quite a bit, it seems like. Early in the season I do quite well, but after some point in May, the fishing seemingly just shuts off in my Back Bay local area over the past couple years, it seems like now. When in previous years I enjoyed great inshore striper fishing throughout late spring and almost all of the summer. There's various reasons why this could be, but ensuring that striped bass have a healthy population and good spawning results are dire to the overall fish stocks and the quality of our fly fishing and just general fishing inshore. Look up Stripers Forever or the Saltwater Guide Association if you'd like to get involved in protecting striped bass and the future of our fishery. Even though we generally consider the spring season as late March to early June, let's say, like the summer solstice, June 21st, striped bass tend to feed and inhabit the local waters in different ways throughout the season. Mike Wright, who is a fantastic local fly angler, although he'll deny these claims, has this to say about the spring season. Yeah, I really think of spring pattern fishing being April to July 5th or 6th. That's the fish migrating into the area still. Then they settle into summer spots, which is a very different attitude. So it's important to pay attention to how the striped bass feed, how they move, and what areas they inhabit at certain times of the year, and keeping track of this stuff is very important. In late spring, of course, it is a great time to start hitting the flats and either working the edges or doing some sight fishing. So shallow, clear water, either inshore or offshore flats, are prime areas for sight fishing or working the edges and drop-offs. A lot of times you'll find the fish either working in what I'd like to call feeding lanes or depressions on the flats where there's subtle changes in water depth, and the fish will follow these edges. One of the ways that me and my friends like to fish the flats in the summertime is not necessarily sight fishing, because having a boat that drafts very little water is key to that, and being able to pole a lot of times or anchor. So what we'll do is we'll just anchor on the edge of a flat in one of my buddy's center consoles, and then we'll fish crab flies and let the crab flies or the baitfish flies naturally drift off the flat into these steep drop-offs. This is a prime place to throw some crab flies or fish some spearing flies, whatever it may be, sand eel flies for the springtime. If you are trying to sight fish, then I recommend either anchoring up if you don't have a poling platform, or you can always pole the flat. And what you want is lawn leaders using fluorocarbon, scaling down the pound test that you're using, and fishing very sparse flies, crab flies that'll sink and will ride hook point up. It's going to take time and practice, but learning how the fish reacts, casting the fly to the fish properly. A lot of times you'll be looking for shadows because striped bass will turn almost a tan color when they move onto the flats and start feeding there regularly, as opposed to the darker color that we'd see on the back on striped bass normally. So we'll have future videos covering flats fishing, but that's a generic overview of flats fishing, sparse flies, lawn leaders, and working either edges or sight fishing. So beach fishing. There's a couple different ways that you can fish the beaches come late spring. Years ago, there weren't many bites that you would find on the open beaches here on the South Shore of Long Island come late May, June, July. You would find activity in the inlets in April and May. Things have changed over the years, and recently the fish have started moving in the springtime, and it seems like there's some bites that are happening, particularly at night. So you want to focus around late May through, let's say, early July, and look for structure on the beach and fishing at night using small to large flies, whether they be hollow flies, bucktail deceivers, flatwings, snake flies. I like flies that push water and ride a little bit higher in the water column. You're less likely to dull out your hook point on the sand. So you're going to have to experiment with either sizes and colors and checking out different areas. As usual with surf fishing, it's a lot of searching and finding the right area to hold the fish and structure. But definitely try and go out this spring and hit the open beaches, because apparently there's been some nice bites going on. So it's something I'm going to try and do myself. Now you can always fish the beaches during the day. There are even places that you can sight fish if the beaches are fairly shallow and flat. Here on the South Shore of Long Island, our beaches have steep drop-offs, so sight fishing isn't always a prime option, and our water isn't always necessarily crystal clear in the ocean. So a lot of times what you can do is tie flies like clousers or mole crab flies, and you can fish these flies letting the waves wash your fly up and then recede down into the troughs. You want to present your fly as naturally as possible. A lot of times your fly will be tumbling down into these troughs and holes, and the striped bass will be waiting and eating the mole crabs that get washed out with the waves. So this is covered pretty well in Alan Calejo's book, but also my buddy Tim over at SouthForkSalt has some great videos about mole crab fishing and particularly tying jigs for spin fishing, but you can apply the same logic to your fly fishing as well. Again, looking for structure, troughs, using the waves to your advantage and working the fly in a natural manner. You want to think about if you've ever been to the beach in the summertime here on Long Island, you'll see the sand fleas get exposed when the sand gets washed away as the tide recedes, and they tumble down into these holes and the striped bass will eat them. So you got to pay attention to how the bait is presented. It's one of the most important things in fly fishing in general. I'll keep mentioning this over and over again because it really is important. Presentation is key. It wouldn't be early or late springtime fishing without talking about cinderworms. Now the cinderworm bite, it's not a hatch. The cinderworms aren't hatching, even though it's been called that for many years. They're spawning. So what you find is the cinderworms will gather right around either the first couple days before the new moon or the full moons, and particularly in salt ponds. I'm going to be making a video about cinderworm hatches in itself because you could spend hours talking about cinderworm hatches and the size of the cinderworms, the times of year, the substrate, the medium that they need. But essentially what you want to do is focus in the salt ponds, focus at times where it is an hour or two before sunset, a couple days before the new or full moon. You want flies that are anywhere from 1.5 to 3.5 inches, really no larger than 3 or 3.5 inches, because it's very rare that this species of worm ever gets larger than that. So the fish know over time, they've just keyed in on this. I have a couple different flies here, whether it be the articulated cinderworm gurgler or a classic just marabou brush cinderworm fly, deer hair head fly, whatever your favorite cinderworm pattern is, make sure it has a lot of movement. You're going to need to learn how these fish feed during cinderworm bites. It's not guaranteed you're going to be catching fish during a cinderworm spawn. Again, talking about presentation, there have been times that I found the only way to get these fish to eat is wait for one to boil or swirl and drop that fly immediately on the same spot. Don't even touch the fly, and then wait about 3 or 4 seconds and they'll just eat it. There were times that you couldn't even touch the fly for them to eat it. There were other times we were stripping it aggressively and they were coming after it. A lot of times you'll see the worms will swim in this figure 8 motion. It's almost impossible to replicate with any bait. But the best thing you can do is look at how the striped bass are feeding and try and replicate what the cinderworms are doing. If they're being swept out with the tide, make sure your fly is being presented naturally. Don't forget to start breaking out the fly poppers once the water starts significantly warming in the late spring. In May, the huge tailing bluefish move in, and we primarily fish Bob's banners exclusively during this gestation activity. So these big bluefish digest the adult bunker that they were feeding on earlier in the day, and they stack up into these daisy chain formations. So a lot of times we'll throw these topwater flies like Bob's banners that make a ton of noise. And many times when fishing for these big blues, we've accidentally caught big stripers on fly poppers, resulting in amazing topwater bites. The introduction of these large baits like the herring and bunker mean that having variety in your fly box is key. Looking for harbors, creeks, marinas, offshore rips, where these large schools of bunker get harassed by big striped bass are pretty important. Sedati slammers, beast flies, grocery deceivers are all great options at this time, and if your fly isn't large enough to properly imitate the bait fish, then it might get passed up. Again, Mark Sedati gave me a great reference where if the fly you were throwing to bluefish wasn't over 10 inches, many times the big bluefish just wouldn't look at it because they were so keyed in on these large adult bunker. So having fast sinking lines and heavy rods like 10 to 12 weights really help ensure that the fly will get down deep through the fast rips and below these bunker pods. Also, having equipment heavy enough to ethically land a fish with a high chance of survival when fishing in fast moving waters or just in general is very important. You may have to travel to find a bunker pod or just areas in general where the big fish are focused, because generally in these times of the year, finding large fish, they're generally concentrated in areas on a particular activity or bite. So if you're traveling from bunker pod to bunker pod, it's important that after a certain amount of casts you move on, because there may not be any fish under there. There's virtually hundreds of bunker pods on the south shore of Long Island every late spring and summer. You may have to travel to find an area where the big fish are focused. Generally, big fish will focus in certain areas for certain feeding activities or migration patterns. So it's important that after, let's say, 4 or 5 casts, if you're fishing on a bunker pod and you don't see any activity that the fish may be being harassed by a big striped bass, that you just move on to the next bunker pod or the next area. Be sure to observe the bunker school's movement. Over time, you'll learn not only to spot these schools, look for purple if you're using polarized sunglasses. Pods of purple on top of the water are a good indication of a bunker school. But you'll also learn what a bunker pod being harassed by a game fish or some sort of marine predator looks like. You'll be able to tell just from the movement how tight the school is, what they're doing on the surface, or if they're down low. Look for holes in the middle of bunker pods. Things like this are great indicators that there might be a fish on one of these bunker pods. So shout out to SouthForkSalt here on YouTube and Instagram. I'll have a link down to his channel below. He has some of the best examples of bunker pods off of the south shore of Long Island. Be sure to head over and subscribe to his channel. He's an awesome guy. So when it comes to books for springtime, I'll name a couple of my favorites. There's many great authors out there and fantastic books, whether it be Lefty Kreh or Bob Popovics or all these different authors. Ken Abrams' Striper Moon and Ray Bondu's Stripers and Streamers are my favorite books in general when it comes to striper fishing. But these 2 books are just chocked full of information about back bay fishing. Another fantastic option is Ed Mitchell's Fly Rotting Estuaries. I haven't talked about Ed Mitchell before, but he is a fantastic author that has quite a lot of books on fly fishing on the East Coast. At some point we'll have to cover him, as he has some fantastic options as well for learning about fly fishing inshore in the Northeast. Well, my name is Mike here from LI Flies Mike. I hope you enjoyed the second episode of fly fishing for striped bass and how temperature and times of year can play a key role in what sort of flies you'll be choosing when fly fishing for striped bass. The next episode in the series will be talking about the three main types of fly choices that are out there, whether it be topwater, weighted flies, or subsurface, and we'll be going over specific flies that you should have for this upcoming fishing season. So if you'd like to see that, as well as fly tying videos as well here on the channel and a ton of other fly fishing content, then be sure to subscribe and let me know what you think down below and if you learned anything about striped bass fishing in general from this video. Thank you again for tuning in. My name is Mike. We have tons of new videos coming out every week. We have live fly tying as well as early access for members. Have a great season out there this year. Until the next video, tight knots.